Good evening, and here we are getting together to talk psychology just for a little short while, because I'd like to bring that into the Parsha of the week, which has, it seems, very little to do with psychology and more with the Shidduch. So let's see where this is going to take us. You're probably all familiar with this gentleman here. That's Abraham Maslow. He was a psychologist of the last century, and he's most famous for the hierarchy of needs. So you've probably seen this triangle because that's how people know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where he posited, and I believe that his philosophy and approach is a little bit out of fashion lately. But he says there's a hierarchy of needs, and you need, that's why I put it in the triangle, because you need to have these needs filled before you can go to the next, and likewise. So the bottom is basic needs, which you divide up into physiological needs. You need to eat, you need to have warmth, you need to sleep, and you need to have a home. And then he went from there. Once you've got that, then you can build on to higher needs that are kind of less important, and therefore and those are psychological needs, as he calls them: belonging and love, esteem, etc. Now, if somebody hasn't eaten in a week, and you say to them, "How's your self-esteem?" Now that's going to be a preposterous question, because he needs food, he needs water. And this individual is not going to be able to function and think about, friends and relationships and anything that's higher on the pyramid, unless the basis of the pyramid is there. So it was his philosophy, his approach, the psychological approach to life and to understanding people's needs, that we had to fill those needs gradually from the most basic to the next level, and finally the top level. And what he calls the top level is self-actualization, and that is purpose, achieving one's full potential, creating self-fulfillment, really having a goal. Now, if you say to somebody who's homeless, who's out in one of those big storms like we've had of late, and he has had nothing to eat for a week, and you say, well, kind of, what's driving you in life? What's going to make you feel fulfilled? Maslow says that person cannot think about that, and that was a philosophy. Maslow was born in Brooklyn, I think 1909. I didn't write it down, so I could be wrong. And Maslow died at the end of the 20th century. Once again, I'm not sure. Could be he lived long and only died in 97. I'd have to double check on that. So that's the famous Abraham Maslow with his pyramid or hierarchy of needs. Around the same time, across the pond, lives a man called Viktor Frankel, Vienna. Born there and actually lived out the rest of his life, also Jewish. And he has a philosophy that is very, very different to Maslow's and possibly clashes with Maslow's. And what does Frankel say? And of course, he is best known for Man's Search for Meaning, the book that he wrote after the Holocaust, which describes how he survived by searching for meaning. And he says, if life is meaningful, if you have a purpose, if you have what Maslow called self-actualization, not the rest doesn't matter, but the rest will be okay. You will be okay because you got something to live for. This is one of his famous saying: if you have a why, you can bear with almost any how. And he also famously said that, you cannot control your circumstances, but you can always control how you personally will react to the circumstances, how you will behave. Now, this is, that's Central Europe. And that's where, Frankel lived his life. And contrast that with our friend Abraham Maslow, who was born in Brooklyn and lived most of his life in California. And you can see kind of, two kinds of Western, old world and new world philosophies clashing somehow, where, in a society of affluence and abundance, in a golden Medina, we're looking at fulfilling basic needs before we can look at, growing and establishing. And in the old world, no, the circumstances in which the previous generations grew up were not always ideally, and the needs were not necessarily met in that order of that beautiful pyramid. And nevertheless, we were tough and we survived. Why? Because we had meaning. And it seems that with time, we've lost that ability. And now we kind of, need to have the house and the car and the restaurant meals. And we can only think about relationships, once we've established ourselves. I mean, the philosophy of today, you got to go and study and have a job, and only then think about settling down and marrying. But how can you possibly have a happy relationship if you're not going to have, the lavish home and the motor cars and the ability to travel and so forth? So it's kind of been a shift. But interestingly, those two psychologists lived concurrently throughout the greater part. I think that Frankel died in 1970, and they lived over the same era. But of course, one lived in Vienna and spent World War II under very adverse conditions. The other one was in the land of abundance, and that must have shaped their approaches. Now, let's leave these two psychological philosophies aside for a while, because we're going to revisit them a little bit later. But I want to see if we can find anything to solve that tension between those two views in our parsha, which seems to be something very unlikely. Bear with me until almost the very end of the parsha. It's about the marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka. And Eliezer is tasked with that mission of finding a wife for Rivka. And he travels east, north and east, and he travels to the land of Avram's ancestry and where his family is. And there he is tasked with the job of coming back with a spouse, with a wife for Yitzchak, suitable wife. And so the Torah describes, after the initial chapter that tells us about the sad death of the mother, Sarah, and Abraham realizing it is time to find a life partner for Yitzchak and sending his servant Eliezer, not mentioned by name, by the way, but we surmise it's Eliezer because he's talking about the one who ran his entire household. Who else would that be? But he's not mentioned by name even once. And Eliezer goes off to Aram Naharaim and meets Rivka. We all know the story. He's at the well, and he says, Hashem, you got to help me. You got to help me find the suitable candidates for my wife, for my master's wife. Well, the suitable wife for my master's son, Yitzchak. I've been tasked with this mission, but how am I going to know? And we're looking for somebody who has the attribute of chesed, who's going to be a kind and caring person. And the sign that he establishes for himself is, I'm going to ask her for water, and that's already going to be, unbelievable kindness. So she's going out to the well to draw water for herself, and now she has to draw extra water for me. And I'm going to see if she notices I've come a long way, my camels are thirsty, and if she offers water for myself as well as the camels, well, then I know that this is the right person. And as Rivka approaches, he notices, first of all, the well rising up towards her, which is already kind of a sign of special qualities there. But he's not looking for a miracle worker. He's looking for somebody with a golden heart, and that's why he takes it to the sign that he had made up for himself, asks her for water, she responds. And then the parsha continues with Eliezer going on to Rivka's home with her and proposing this shidduch, this marriage, telling them the entire story of what had happened, that he'd been sent on this mission, that miraculously, I failed to mention before, there was something called Kfitzat Haderech, where kind of the distance shrunk, and he found himself within hours of leaving what would have been a journey that should have taken many days. He finds himself on the same day at the edge of the town where Rivka lives, already kind of a divine sign that there's Hashem's hand and help to make this happen here. And all of the rest, that he asked her from which family she is, that he gave her gifts, that he asked her about feeding the camel, watering the camels at least, and that she did this, and a camel can consume a vast amount of water, liters and liters and liters of water. So it's no small offer to say I'm going to feed the camels, I'm going to give water to the camels. And so deals concluded, bit of give and take negotiation back and forth, and finally, family of Rivka, her mother and brother Lavan, consent to the shidduch, and she's sent back with the servant to the land of Canaan, to the Holy Land, where they're going to meet. And let's read the kind of final verses of the parasha that describe this meeting of Yitzchak and Rivka and Eliezer out in the field. So there is Yitzchak. He's gone out to the field. It says that he went out, lasuach basadeh, meditate in the field, converse, talk in the field towards the afternoon. And we actually learned from this that Yitzchak is the kind of initiator of the mincha prayer, because this is the time of the mincha prayer. And, he wasn't just going to have a conversation with himself in the fields, but rather to have a conversation with Hashem. And there he sees the camels coming his way. This is the caravan. Eliezer, Rivka, entourage, and goods, and so forth. And Rivka notices this, and she comes off the camel when she sees Yitzchak, and now the meeting is going to take place. And at this point, Eliezer tells Yitzchak all that he had done. Now, that's everything I've told you. As Rashi comments, the servant reported him the miracles that had wrought for him, how the earth had shrunk for him, as I mentioned before, kfitzat haderech, called jumping of the road. In other words, that they arrived on the day that they had left, how Rivka was ready for him in response to his prayer, the rising waters, etc. Basically, as was the reaction of Betuel and Lavan, the father and brother of Rivka, their words when he told the story was, "Me'Hashem yatzah davar." This is straight from Hashem. How can we, the pointers are clear, divine providence, that God is directing, that this is the shidduch. And the parents were prepared to send Rivka away to this faraway land on the basis that this is clearly divinely ordained. It doesn't seem that that's Yitzchak's response. It does not assume that he says, oh, well, all the pointers are that this is divine, and this is clearly my wife. No. He's going to watch very carefully what happens next. And so Yitzchak brings her into his mother Sarah's tent, and only then took Rivka, and she became his wife. He loved her. Yitzchak is now comforted after his mother's death, and that's where the story ends. There's a bit of a digression to talk about the family of Yishmael before we move on to next week's parasha, which talks about Yitzchak and Rivka married and praying for children and all that happens at that stage. So there's a stage that has to happen. There's a step that has to happen before Yitzchak actually marries Rivka. He brings her into her mother's Sarah's tent and then takes Rivka, and she becomes his wife. This is a strange spelling for Rivka, I must say. I didn't type it. Says Rashi, into his mother Sarah's tent. He brings her into the tent, and she is like his mother. In other words, the words Ho'ela Sarah Ima mean that when he brought her into a tent, behold, She was just like Sarah, his mother, had been. So something happens that convinces him that that Rivka is a worthy successor to his mother, that she is the next matriarch. And what happens there? So what happens there, Rashi tells us, and he bases this on Medrash Rabbah, Jairus' Rabbah, while Sarah was living, three things occurred in the tent. First of all, the light burnt in the tent from one Shabbos Eve to the next, so she lit a Shabbos candles on Friday night, and those candles kind of had a weekly Hanukkah miracle. There was always blessing in the dough, miraculous increase. So whatever she baked, I'm not sure whether it was sort of quantitative or qualitative, whether the bread tasted so good that you could have a tiny morsel and that would fill you, or whether the dough rose tremendously and far more than the ingredients you put in. And there was a cloud that hung over the tent as divine protection. But since her death, all these had stopped, and Rivka comes and the signs reappear. And it's when that happens that Yitzchak says, I'm going to marry her. He marries her, and the verse concludes, he is comforted after his mother's death. So when Yitzchak brings her into the mother's tent, and she actually fills the mother's tent, but actually bringing that same aura of sanctity and of miracle and of serenity, Yitzchak says, "This is it." Now, what is this? And I mean, where does the Medrash have it from? That these were the three miracles that happened there. And side note, often the Medrash is often an oral tradition. Rashi bases everything on the literal meaning of the text. So if Rashi tells us, quoting from the Medrash, that these three things happened, he's going to have to find it somewhere in the text. But I don't know if you noticed it, but I didn't. When I read it, it just said he brought it into Sarah's tent, but there was nothing about candles, there was nothing about dough, and there was nothing about the cloud that rested above. So where did Rashi find an allusion to these three elements in the verses? And the answer is in those three words, which are really redundant words, the words that read to us in the tent of Sarah, his mother. Ha'ohela Sarah imo. If we analyze the three words, we will find that they allude to these three principles that we've just spoken about. So the first word is ha'ohela, in the tent, and that hey, ha, that's the definite article, so it becomes the tent. And for Bible scholars, they've come across this before. Because just a few years earlier, there was the Akedah. And off Abraham and Yitzchak went, together with, incidentally, Eliezer, Ishmael as well, and off they go to Mount Moriah, but they don't know where they have to go. And God says, go to the mountain that I will show you. And then after 3 days walking, it says, they saw Hamakom Merachok. They saw the place from far. So that definite article is a trigger. So the commentaries say there, what did they see? They saw that there was a cloud wrapped around Mount Moriah, and that was an indication, in fact, as the Midrashim tell us there, Abraham turns to the other two gentlemen who were with them, Eliezer and Ishmael, and says, what do you see? And they say, well, nothing, just this rock and desert landscape. And he turns to Yitzchak. He says, what do you see? And he says, well, I see a cloud representing, of course, the Shekhinah that is resting on the mountain. And Abraham, of course, saw it himself as well. And they realize this is a sign. Abraham says to Ishmael and Eliezer, you remain here, and we're going to go up to the mountain. We'll see you just now, as South Africans would say. So that definite article, Ha'ohela, is an indication that on the Ohel there is a divine presence, the Shekhinah resting in the form of a cloud. And that's what Rashi says, there was a cloud resting, hovering over the tent. And then the word Sarah. Now, what does Sarah make us think of? Sarah was the woman who baked the bread. When Abraham looked after the angels who came to visit in last week's parasha, he actually exerted himself to prepare a meal for them in ways that maybe weren't all that safe for a man who just had a bris and he was no youngster. And he ran to look after the guests, and he ran to catch animals and to feed them and so forth. But the bread, it says, Abraham said to Sarah, Mari Lushi, God, please take 3 measures of flour and go ahead and make the cakes, make the rolls for these visitors. So when we think of Sarah, immediately we have that connection with the incident where the woman bakes the bread and has the mitzvah of separating the challah, as we'll discuss in a moment. And then Imo, the mother, and the allusion, the association of the mother is immediately to Shabbat candles. So these 3 kind of symbols, miracles that occurred in her home were miracles that actually refer to the 3 mitzvot of women specifically. Of course, there are lots of mitzvot in Torah. There are many obligations, and some are particularly incumbent upon men. And 3 mitzvot, symbolized by the initial letters of the word Chana, those represent the 3 mitzvot that are specific to women, and those relate back to the 3 elements we just discussed. So, sorry, that came out in the wrong order. Chala, the chet, that is the mitzvah of baking bread, but that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah is that when you make a dough, you separate a proportion, and that's going to be given and consecrated to Hashem. And that's why, in fact, our braided breads on Shabbos in South Africa, referred to as kitka, are known in the rest of the world as challah, because it was often that the challah was baked in the home. The rest of the week, the bread was purchased in the bakery. The challah for Shabbos was baked in the home, and then the woman of the house got to perform that specific mitzvah of her. So that's the chet of Chana. The nun represents the mitzvah of nida, which is a family purity, and that was the cloud hovering to symbolize the home that is blessed with purity. And then there was here. Let's get this in this order. The hay, which represents Hadlakat Haner, or the lighting of candles, which of course was a candle that went from week to week. And those are all 3 mitzvot that are specifically reserved for the woman, even though men would light candles. If there was no woman in the house, a man who makes a dough is obliged to set aside challah, and of course the mitzvah of nida, that is specifically the mikveh and the family purity is for a married couple, and most of that would be incumbent upon the wife to observe the mitzvah of mikveh. So that is the 3 mitzvot. But now let's look at the way Rashi puts it, the order, because we, remember, talked about ha'ohela Sarah imo, the tent. That's a cloud. That's a cloud that's hovering as divine protection. Then Sarah, which refers to the dough, and then Imo, which refers to the Shabbos candles. But when Rashi puts it to us, he reverses the order. And in fact, if you look in the original text, in Bereshit Rabbah and Genesis Rabbah, you will find that the order is exactly as I said. Rashi seems to reverse the order. What will be the reason why Rashi reverses the order? Well, let's think back of Maslow versus Frankel, and where the priorities lie. What does the tent represent? Shelter. The dough, food. Those are the basic needs. Those that are in Maslow's pyramid at the very bottom. What do we have? What do we have with the Shabbos candles? That's light. Light is essentially spiritual. Light essentially allows us to see a dimension of something which isn't really visible otherwise. So if you are in a room that has beautiful furniture and amazing food on the dining room table, and chandeliers and paintings on the wall, but the lights are off, it's all there, but you're unaware of any of that. And then dark, it's night, somebody flicks the light, or load shedding comes to an end, and the lights go on, and suddenly you discover a deeper dimension to what you thought was just a space, but now realize it's a space that is beautiful, that is has got food for you, that is welcoming, all things that you were totally unaware without the light. So light gives a dimension of appreciation to that's spirituality. We get a world where we don't really see the entire depth of the world in which we exist. But the light that we have, that is a spirituality which shines and enhances the dimension of every aspect of our lives. And that spirituality is, of course, a meaning, a task, and what we're all about. Where does that fit in? Does that come last, or does that come first? So Rashi is very particular to negate the Maslow approach of, let's see to all the physical and even psychological needs before we can search for a deeper meaning. And Rashi deliberately reverses the order to tell us first light, then food, and then the home. First, we need to find that spiritual spark that's going to animate us. And once we have discovered that, then the rest will fall into place. So Rashi digresses from the order of the source that he's quoting, the Matriarch. He digresses from the direct interpretation and intercalation of the three words from where he learns his whole lesson to teach us an additional lesson. That in that tension between the approaches of Frankel and Maslow, respectively, we have to realize that the most important thing is first to have purpose, to have meaning, to have direction, and to have light. Thank you very much, and have a good night.